They called it oxidizing to get someone into the Oxford groups, and as Dr. Bob drove the family car around to find drunks, they called his car the Ark. And when Frank Bookman went to the Olympic Games in Berlin in the summer of 1936, there were Oxford groups in all the major towns in Germany, and the Nazis had been watching them. Bookman became friends with some of the leading Nazis, and he told them that England and Canada were seething with communism. And when asked if Himmler was a friend of his, Bookman said, "Half the lies they tell you about the Irish aren't true." Allentown Morning Call, May 1941. When Bookman got back from the Olympic Games, the New York World Telegram interviewed him, and Alcoholics Anonymous would write, "On the 25th of August in 1936, the New York World Telegram published an article about Bookman, charging that he was pro-Nazi. The newspaper quoted Bookman as saying, 'I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler who built a front-line defense against the Antichrist of communism. Think what it would mean to the world if Hitler surrendered to God. Through such a man, God could control a nation and solve every problem. Human problems aren't economic, they're moral, and they can't be solved by immoral measures.' While most discussions of the incident, even by Bookman's critics, have since vindicated him, the article brought the group into public controversy. At the same time, a subtle change took place in both the message and the function of the Oxford group. It moved from small, intimate groups to large gatherings. In 1938, after Oxford University requested that the group, because of the controversy, no longer use its name, it took the name Moral Rearmament, abbreviated to MRA. Increasingly, it worked with national and world assemblies. A number of the early followers withdrew from the movement, dissatisfied with the shift from individual emphasis to mass methods. Pass it on, page 170 to 71. After that, the Oxford groups grew too large for comfort, and they also started concentrating on nations instead of individuals, and Bookman said, "I'm all for the drunks being changed, but we also have drunken nations on our hands." Pass it on, page 131. Bookman had served America in the Great War looking after German POWs, and as everyone was getting ready for Hitler's war, Bookman was talking about guidance or guns, and he was saying that the Munich Pact was the result of divine intervention. And in 1938, Oxford University told Frank Bookman to quit using their name. Hitler's friends were using the Oxford groups to try to meet rich and famous people that might help the Nazi movement forge ahead, and at Christmas of 1939, Dr. Bob took a vote on moving out of the Oxford group movement, and at his first meeting after formally splitting with the Oxforders, there would be 74 people meeting at Dr. Bob's house. A story emerged that some Oxford groupers came to Dr. Bob's first AA meeting and tried to break it up, threatening physical violence, but there is no record of what happened at the first meeting except for a grapevine account years later noting that it was led by Dr. Bob, who, quote, "put his foot on the rung of a dining room chair, identified himself as an alcoholic, and began reading the Sermon on the Mount." Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 218. Bill W. and Lois had already left the Oxford groups in 1937, but Dr. Bob and his friends had continued to attend until 1939. And Bill had started to write the big book in May of 1938, and the first 2 chapters were done by June, with the working title 100 Men by Alcoholics Anonymous, and the idea of writing the big book had won approval in Akron by only 1 vote. To get a book published, Bill W. began trying to raise money, and Charles Towns lent them 1/3 of the money needed to publish the book, Capitalism, and a printer donated the first run, Christian Charity, and Dr. Bob borrowed $1,200 in 1939 from his mother. Bill W. asked the Guggenheim Foundation for a grant, but they told him that they only gave money to support the arts, and a Mr. X-Man at Harper's offered to publish it, but Bill thought that might not be a good idea because the AAs would lose control of it, so they were in agreement that they would have to publish it themselves instead. Bill W. came up with the idea of selling shares of stock, and he certainly knew how. And the original was sold for $3.50 and was printed on very thick paper that was the cheapest kind, making it a big fat book, and so it was called the Big Book. One small group wanted to call the book Coming Back, and Bill came up with the name Works Publishing to put on the stock shares, and the first printing of the book would be in the spring of 1939, and it had been written when they were all under 5 years sober. Dr. Strong had gotten Bill W. linked up with Rockefeller in November of 1937, and Rockefeller had been a Prohibition champion, and his son John D. Rockefeller, Jr., gave the AAs $1,000 and bought 400 copies of the book to pass around to his rich friends, who donated another $2,000, and that would be repeated for several years. John Rockefeller, Jr. had been born in Cleveland, and he gave Dr. Bob $3,000 to pay off his mortgage and granted $30 per week to Bill W. and Dr. Bob to make it possible for them to continue their work. Dr. Charles Towns loaned them $4,000 in 1938 to get the book written, and for that he received 400 shares, and Towns would loan them another $2,500 later, and sometimes Ruth Hawk was paid in Works Publishing stock when money got tight. Then the guy who put his name on the stock certificates as president got drunk after trying to become over-friendly with Ruth, and she told him to take a shower, and he never really got sober after that. The Alcoholic Foundation was born in May of 1938, and 90 days later in August, they established a board of trustees with 5 members, 3 of them non-alcoholics. And the following year they expanded the board of trustees to 7. Bill W. served on an advisory committee with 8 members that had an alcoholic majority, and Bill suggested that every AA member pitch in $1 a year towards office expenses, and by Christmas it was discovered that there were 8,000 members, and Bill called 1941, quote, the most exciting year of our history. Alcoholics Anonymous comes of age. A Brief History of AA, New York Alcoholics Anonymous World Services, Inc., 1957-1985, page 192. People got fired up at Dr. Bob and Bill W. for getting royalties on the Big Book and for accepting their $30 a week, so people started talking behind their backs, and soon there were rumors that they were making tens of thousands of dollars from book sales. So they called in a professional to go over the books and showed the records to the membership, who were easily satisfied and pleased with the report now that they were sober. The first mail-order group began in Little Rock, Arkansas, and as a result, the AA group spread to Green Bay and to Detroit, and then to Canada, and to Richmond, Virginia, and to Long Beach, California. And when a Houston newspaper published a series of 6 articles about AA, the Houston groups grew and spread to Austin and to Tampa and to Los Angeles. As local newspapers printed stories about AA, the groups moved into the Deep South and to Hawaii and to Australia and Norway and South Africa and Alaska and Mexico and South America, and over to England and to Holland and to France. And Alcoholics Anonymous would write that they went then to Japan and even Greenland and Iceland. The story of Captain Jack in a Standard Oil tanker spreading AA as he sailed. In such happy reminiscences, we at St. Louis reviewed AA's crossing of the barriers of distance, race, creed, and tongue, and saw our fellowship reaching to the 4 corners of the earth. AA Comes of Age, page 26. It had taken a year to write the Big Book, and Ruth had been typing it, although sometimes Bill W. just dictated it to her. And the Big Book first came out on the 10th of April in 1939, and it would get to Los Angeles in the fall, carried by a woman named Kay. On the 25th of April, the AAs did a radio show, and the day after, Bill W. and Lois were homeless, when the mortgage company assumed the house that Lois's family had lived in for 50 years. And for the next 2 years, Lois and Bill would live with AA friends, staying here and there for a while. In early 1940, the AAs opened their first clubhouse at 334.5 West 24th Street, in a building that had once been a stable and had then become the Artists and Illustrators Club, and Bill W. and Lois moved into one of the upstairs rooms on the 4th of November, and they would live there for 5 months, and, quote, whatever hour Bill wandered in, there was the feel of a meeting, close quote, pass it on, page 239. The book was being reviewed in many newspapers and magazines, magazine journals, and church bulletins, and a few dozen big books had been selling every week, and Dr. Bob wrote an article for Faith magazine in August of 1939, and he received a reply from 12 doctors, and 2 of them wanted to buy a copy of the book. The New York Times had given a book review in June of 1939, and an article in Liberty magazine called Alcoholics and God came out on the 30th of September in 1939, and the Journal of the American Medical Association wrote in the book notices on the 7th of October in 1939. The book under review is a curious combination of organizing propaganda and religious exhortation. It is in no sense a scientific book, although it is introduced by a letter from a physician who claims to know some of the anonymous contributors who have been quote-unquote cured of alcoholism, of addiction to alcohol, and have joined together in an organization which would save other addicts by a kind of religious conversion. The book contains instructions as how to intrigue the alcoholic addict into the acceptance of divine guidance in place of alcohol, in terms strongly reminiscent of Dale Carnegie and the adherents of the Buchmann Oxford movement. The one valid thing in the book is the recognition of the seriousness of addiction to alcohol. Other than this, the book has no scientific merit or interest. JAMA, Volume 113, Number 16. An article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer was published as a 5-part series in October of 1939, and it was based on a writer having been snuck into the meetings while pretending to be an alcoholic. And within a year of the Cleveland Plain Dealer series, there would be 30 groups and several hundred members in Cleveland. From there, someone from one of the Cleveland groups had gone to Houston and written the articles for the Houston Press, and that's how Texas had gotten AA, and from there it went to Miami. The following spring, on the 24th of February in 1941, Jack Alexander wrote an article about AA for the Saturday Evening Post that came out on the 1st of March, and that story brought in 6,000 letters. And the Saturday Evening Post article had been titled, Alcoholics Anonymous, freed slaves of drink, now they free others. The Cleveland group voted out the undercover guy who wrote the article, so he just went and started another group, and his trick was to put the newcomers to work right away, such as the Wagon Club, that would collect old furniture for reconditioning, and they would get the new people to fix it up and then sell it. The Dr. Bob book said that this Cleveland group was responsible for starting the tradition. All you need to start a new AA group is a resentment and a coffee pot. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 166. They met in Dr. Bob's house for a while, but it became too crowded, and so they went and rented space at the King's School. And that was the first time they had to take up collections to pay the rent. When AA began, magnetic audio tape recording was just being developed, so their personal stories were spoken aloud as a means of staying sober, and if the description of their drinking days fell on deaf ears, they would at least be helping themselves in remembering. At the beginning of the meetings, they would read from the book of James, and they would read the Sermon on the Mount, and they would read from the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and they also read from the upper room. The meetings at Dr. Bob's house were almost called the James Club because they read from that book so often, and after Ann and Bob read aloud from the Bible, they would share spiritual experiences, although they did not tolerate treating the meetings as confessionals, but insisted on talks about experience, strength, and hope, and anyone describing immoral acts or boasting about bad behavior was seen as not helpful and were told politely to change the subject. They would not even talk about their drinking very much, but saved those stories for newcomers or hospital interviews. And the early AAs did not want to make the same mistake as the teetotalers who had given speeches about their drunken sprees in order to entertain people who wanted to laugh at alcoholics, willing to tell their secrets in public. "You would be surprised how little talk there was of drinking experience even among ourselves," Wally said. "That was usually kept for the interviews with new prospects in the hospital. We were more interested in our everyday life than we were in reminiscing about drinking." Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 141. One story had it that when Dr. Bob was guest speaker at an out-of-town meeting, he got up and said that the world's finest talks had been short ones. For example, both the Sermon on the Mount and the Gettysburg Address had been given in less than 5 minutes. "With this point in mind," he said, "I also propose to give a short talk. In fact, I just did." He sat down. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 224. "He was a very calm speaker, and he sounded grateful," said Ed B., an Akron old-timer. "Sometimes he would point his finger or spread his arms, but he didn't gesture much, and he always wore a suit and tie to the meetings. When he came to an AA meeting, he was just another alcoholic. He wasn't a doctor or anything." In Dr. Bob's comments, he would always pick some good point the speaker had made. According to Ed, it was more or less to encourage him. He never mentioned much about his own drinking. Ibid. Speakers were not always chosen in advance, according to Norman Y. He recalled Dr. Bob's telling one fellow, "George, it's your turn this week." "But I didn't prepare anything," the man replied. "You didn't prepare to get drunk either," Dr. Bob said. "Get up and talk." Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 223. The AAs always dressed up to go to meetings, and people were allowed to come to the meetings drunk if they behaved themselves, since the drunk was doing them all a favor, either showing what would happen if they picked up a drink or if they got sober. It was proof that the program worked. They didn't have chairpersons or secretaries, but a speaker would start with a short reading and a 5-minute talk, and then the members would make comments, and there was no laughing or clapping because they were there on serious business. They didn't like people making drinking sound sensational, and they did not talk about their drinking days because they knew each other well enough to know the details already, and instead they talked about how it was that they were staying sober, and Dr. Bob said that nobody should ever talk more than 15 minutes, or they would begin to repeat themselves. There was a guy named Norman who was blind from drinking bootleg alcohol. And at his first AA meeting, they told him that he didn't really want to get sober. He just wanted to come around and beg for money. But a voice in his head told him to go, and to go regularly, and not to take anything material from these people, not even from doing service work for them. And a year later, he got a job helping other blind people, and he put 10% of his salary into an account to pay for his AA expenses. And after 5 years, his wife and family came back. Somebody showed up who couldn't afford to stay in the hospital, and they let that person come to the meetings anyway. But first, he said, they, quote, made me go to the home of one of the newer members every night for 3 months, and they had 9 or 10 people talking to me. Then I had to read the big book before I went to my first meeting. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 169. Because the word Catholic meant universal, while Orthodox meant correct, Dr. Bob was Catholic, while Bill was Orthodox, and by October of 1940, 25% of the AAs were Roman Catholics. Cleveland did better than Akron, so people thought that AA had started in Cleveland, and from Akron it had spread to Chicago, and from Chicago to Milwaukee and to Minneapolis, and sober alcoholics would come to Akron and hang around until they found out everything they could from the originals, and then go back to wherever they'd come from to carry the message they had learned in Akron.